there's a number that should terrify you. $1.4 trillion. That's how much developing nations paid just in interest on foreign debt in 2023. Not principal, not paying down what they owe, just interest. $1.4 trillion extracted from the poorest countries on Earth and transferred to creditors in Washington, London, and Paris. That's more than the entire GDP of Spain, more than the GDP of Australia. And it's just the interest payment for a single year. But here's what makes this number truly devastating. For every single dollar of aid that flows into the developing world, $14 flows out through underpriced exports, overcharged imports, and profits repatriated by foreign corporations. Read that again. For every $1 in, $14 out. That's not aid. That's extraction. That's not development assistance. That's systematic wealth transfer on a scale never seen in human history. And over the past 6 decades, this machine has drained $62 trillion from poor and developing nations into the banks and corporations of the first world. $62 trillion. That's more than the combined GDP of the United States and China. That's nearly double the entire global debt. And it's been extracted systematically, legally, through a mechanism that most people have never heard of, but that controls the economic fate of 152 countries. That mechanism is called the International Monetary Fund. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how the IMF debt trap works, why it's the most effective colonization tool ever invented, how it's destroyed entire continents, and most terrifyingly, why the United States is now walking into the exact same trap that has enslaved the developing world for 60 years. Because this isn't just about Africa or Latin America or Asia anymore. This is about the end of American economic sovereignty, and the timeline is 5 to 10 years. Let me start by showing you the scale of what's actually happening right now, because most people have no idea how extreme the extraction has become. The developing world currently owes $31 trillion in total debt. Now, you might think that's not that much. The US alone has $38 trillion in debt. But here's the difference. The United States borrows in its own currency that it prints. We can inflate away our debt. We control the Federal Reserve. We set our own monetary policy. Developing nations don't have that luxury. They borrow in dollars or euros or yen, currencies they don't control. And when they can't pay, but they lose everything. Right now, nearly 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress. That's a technical term that means they're struggling to meet debt obligations and are on the verge of default or have already defaulted. 60%. That's not a few outliers. That's the majority of the poorest countries on Earth trapped in unpayable debt. And here's where it gets mathematically insane. Many of these governments now spend more money paying interest to foreign creditors than they spend on healthcare, education, and infrastructure combined. Let me show you a real example so you understand the mechanics. Zambia. Between 2018 and 2021, just 3 years, Zambia's debt repayments jumped from 20% of the national budget to 38%. In the same period, healthcare funding dropped from 9.5% to 8%. Education funding collapsed from 17% in 2016 to just 12% in 2022. Think about what that actually means. In 2022, Zambia spent 38% of its entire budget paying interest to foreign banks, while only 12% went to educating its children. The country is literally sacrificing its future to pay creditors. And this isn't unique. This is the standard pattern across dozens of countries trapped in IMF programs. Cut education, cut healthcare, cut infrastructure, pay the debt. Always pay the debt. And if you don't, the IMF cuts off your access to international credit markets, your currency collapses, and your economy implodes. So, countries have no choice but to comply. This is economic slavery with a spreadsheet. Now, let me show you who's actually in control of this system. Because understanding the power structure tells you everything about whose interests are being served. The IMF has 190 member nations, nearly every country on Earth, but the voting power isn't distributed equally. Not even close. The United States alone holds veto power over every major IMF decision. One country out of 190 can block anything. And overall, the global north, the wealthy industrialized nations, has 9 times more voting power than the global south combined. 9 times. So while the IMF presents itself as a global institution, a neutral arbiter helping countries in crisis, it is actually a boardroom controlled by the richest economies on Earth, making decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. And here's proof that the system is rigged. For 65 years, every single managing director of the IMF has come from Western Europe. Not Africa, not Asia, not Latin America, Europe, every time. For For 65 years, the institution that controls the economic fate of 152 developing nations has never been led by someone from a developing nation. That's not coincidence, that's design. Now, let me show you how the debt trap actually works. Because once you understand the mechanism, you'll see why it's nearly impossible to escape. The pattern follows 5 stages, and it's been repeated in over 100 countries with almost identical results every time. Stage 1, the crisis hook. You can't trap a healthy, stable nation with debt. They don't need to borrow, so you wait for crisis. War, natural disaster, economic collapse, political instability, commodity price crash. When a country is desperate and facing collapse, that's when you offer the loan. But the IMF doesn't create the crisis. They just wait for it. And when it comes, they position themselves as the only salvation. The country is drowning. The IMF throws a rope, but the rope has a noose at the end. Stage 2, the conditional loan. The IMF offers emergency funding to stabilize the crisis, but the loan comes with conditions, lots of conditions. They call it conditionality. It sounds technical and reasonable. In reality, it's a takeover manual. To get the loan, the country must agree to cut government spending, especially on social programs. Raise taxes to ensure debt repayment. Remove subsidies on food, fuel, and essential goods. Privatize state-owned industries and sell them to foreign corporations. Open markets to foreign imports and remove protections for local industries. Devalue the currency to make exports cheaper and boost foreign exchange. Restructure the tax system to prioritize debt repayment over public services. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements. If the country refuses any condition, the loan is denied, and without the loan, the economy collapses immediately. So governments sign. They have no choice. Stage 3, the austerity spiral. Once the country accepts IMF conditions and receives the loan, the real destruction begins. Government spending is slashed. Public sector workers are fired. Subsidies on food and fuel are removed, causing prices to spike. Schools and hospitals lose funding. Infrastructure projects are canceled. State-owned enterprises, often the most profitable parts of the economy, are sold to foreign corporations at fire sale prices. And the economy doesn't recover. It gets worse. Independent evaluations found that countries under IMF programs grew on average 1.5 percentage points below the IMF's own projections in the first year. Let me say that again. The IMF's own programs cause economies to shrink more than even the IMF predicted. That's not a rescue, that's sabotage. And as the economy shrinks, tax revenues fall, unemployment rises, poverty spreads, and the government, now with less revenue and more problems, can't meet its debt obligations. So what happens? They go back to the IMF for another loan. Stage 4, the dependency trap. This is where the trap closes completely. The country is now addicted to IMF loans. They take new loans to pay interest on old loans. It's a Ponzi scheme. Each new loan comes with more conditions, more privatizations, more cuts, more foreign control. The IMF releases loans and trenches, meaning the money comes in installments. To get the next installment, the country must meet specific targets set by the IMF. If they miss a target, the next payment is frozen. And if the IMF freezes a payment, international investors panic, the currency crashes, and the economy implodes. So governments do whatever the IMF demands to keep the money flowing. They lose control of their own economic policy. The IMF dictates how much they can spend, what they can tax, which industries to privatize, which laws to change. The government becomes a puppet. The IMF pulls the strings, and the country is trapped in what economists call perpetual debt distress. They can never pay off the debt. They can never escape IMF oversight. They're a sovereign nation on paper, but a debt colony in reality. Stage 5, the permanent extraction. Once a country is locked in the dependency trap, the extraction begins in earnest and never stops. Let me show you the numbers from Africa, because that is where the extraction is most visible and most devastating. Every single year, 88.6 billion leaves Africa through capital flight. And that's nearly 4% of the continent's entire GDP. Gone. Not invested in roads or schools or hospitals, extracted and transferred to banks in London, New York, and Paris. That's $88.6 billion annually that could rebuild infrastructure, fund education, develop industries. Instead, it flows out as loan repayments, repatriated profits, and illicit financial transfers. And this has been happening for decades. Over the past 60 years, $62 trillion has been drained from the developing world into wealthy nations. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire global economy produces in a single year. That's generational wealth gone forever. And the results are catastrophic. From 1979 to 1992, Africa's GDP grew less than 1% total over 13 years. Not per year, total. 13 years of IMF reforms, and the continent's economy was essentially frozen. Investment collapsed. Factories shut down. Africa's share of world exports fell by more than half. In 1970, Africa supplied over 20% of the developing world's agricultural exports. By 1990, that dropped to just 8%. Manufacturing collapsed even worse, from nearly 8% of developing world exports to just over 1%. Let me be clear about what this means. Africa was deindustrialized. The continent went backwards, and it happened under IMF supervision. The programs that were supposed to create growth destroyed entire industries instead. And here's the most brutal irony. There are now twice as many Africans living in absolute poverty today in raw numbers than there were in 1980. 40 years of IMF programs, billions in loans, endless reforms, and poverty doubled. That's not failure. That's by design. Because the IMF was never designed to develop Africa. It was designed to keep Africa as a source of cheap resources and a captive market for Western goods. Now, let me show you how this works in practice with specific examples, because the pattern is identical across continents. Zambia. In the 2000s, under IMF pressure, Zambia privatized its copper mines, the lifeblood of the national economy. The promise was efficiency and foreign investment. The reality was unemployment, lost revenue, and foreign corporations extracting wealth. The mines were sold for a fraction of their value to multinational corporations who received tax exemptions and profit guarantees. Zambia, once the world's third largest copper producer, ended up earning less from copper exports than Chile, which had similar output. Why? Because the profits flowed overseas, the corporations extracted the copper, paid minimal taxes, and sent profits back to shareholders in London and Toronto. Zambia got the hole in the ground. The West got the wealth, Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Western economists and the IMF pushed something called shock therapy. The idea was to transition from communism to capitalism overnight, privatize everything, remove price controls, open markets to foreign competition immediately. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin implemented the plan. The result was the most catastrophic economic collapse in modern peacetime history. Prices exploded 2,500% in the first year, while wages stayed frozen. Life savings were wiped out overnight. Poverty went from essentially zero under the Soviet system to over 40% of the population. Life expectancy dropped by 6 years. Entire industries collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed. And while the economy burned, a small group of men, many with ties to Western banks, bought up state assets for pennies. Oil companies, gas monopolies, steel plants, banks, all sold at absurd discounts. That's how Russian oligarchs were created. Not through entrepreneurship, but through IMF-backed privatization schemes that transferred Soviet state wealth to private hands in the largest robbery in human history. And the pattern continues. Argentina followed the same script in the 1990s, privatized industries under IMF guidance. For a few years, money poured in. Then in 2001, the economy collapsed. Banks froze accounts. The currency crashed. Unemployment hit 25%. Millions fell into poverty, all under IMF supervision. Let me now show you why this matters to you as an American right now in 2026. Because the same debt trap mechanism that destroyed the developing world is being deployed against the United States. And most Americans have no idea it's happening. The U.S. national debt is $38 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio 128%. We are 2 percentage points away from the 130% threshold where every empire in history has faced systemic crisis. We're paying $1.2 trillion per year in interest, over 20% of federal revenue. And that percentage is rising exponentially as old debt gets refinanced at higher rates. We're in stage 3 of the debt trap, the austerity spiral. We're not there yet in terms of IMF control, but we're following the exact mathematical pattern. Borrowing new money to pay interest on old debt. Running $2+ trillion annual deficits with no plan to reduce them. Watching interest costs consume the budget while infrastructure crumbles and social programs get cut. And here's the terrifying question. What happens when the US can't pay? What happens when we hit stage 4 and need a bailout? Who bails out the country that prints the world's reserve currency? The answer is nobody. The dollar collapses. Reserve currency status is lost. And the US enters a debt restructuring with international creditors. That restructuring will look very similar to what the IMF imposes on developing nations. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, the EU. They'll demand concessions, control over strategic ports and infrastructure, ownership stakes in critical industries, territorial concessions, or long-term leases on land and assets, direct access to US tax revenues to ensure debt repayment, and international debt administration, similar to the Ottoman Empire's 1881 model, where foreign creditors collect US taxes and send them directly to creditors. This sounds impossible, absurd, but it's exactly what happened to every other country that crossed the debt threshold and couldn't pay. Economic sovereignty ends. Political sovereignty becomes meaningless. You become a debt colony flying your own flag. The timeline based on current trajectories. 2024-2027. Stage 3 intensifies. Deficits remain above 2 TAG annually. Interest costs rise to 1.5 T than 2 T per year. Political paralysis prevents any meaningful reform. 2027-2030 stage 4 begins. A failed treasury auction or a major geopolitical crisis triggers loss of confidence. Foreign creditors demand higher yields or stop buying altogether. The Fed is forced to monetize debt at massive scale. Dollar credibility shatters. 2030-2035 stage 5 debt restructuring. Some form of international debt conference where the global monetary system is restructured and the US is forced to accept foreign oversight of fiscal policy in exchange for continued credit access. This is the same 5-stage pattern that's destroyed 152 developing nations, and we're in stage 3 right now. So what do you actually do? How do you protect yourself when your own country is walking into a debt trap? First, understand that the IMF model teaches us wealth flows from debtors to creditors. If you're a debtor, you're enslaved. If you're a creditor, you profit. Eliminate personal debt aggressively. The debt trap works on individuals the same way it works on nations. Second, position in hard assets that maintain value regardless of currency stability. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, productive real estate, anything that isn't just a claim on someone's promise to pay. Third, build skills that produce real value. The IMF pattern shows that when economies collapse, only people with tangible skills survive. Medical, agricultural, mechanical, construction, anything that can't be offshored or automated. Fourth, have international optionality. Don't keep 100% of your assets in one jurisdiction. Diversify across countries and currencies. Fifth, watch the indicators. US debt to GDP crossing 140%. Danger zone. Failed treasury auction crisis beginning. Creation of international fiscal oversight, sovereignty ending. Let me bring this to a conclusion with the core truth. The IMF is not a rescue organization. It's a debt enforcement mechanism, a tool of financial colonization that's transferred $62 trillion from the poorest countries on Earth to the wealthiest over 6 decades. It promises stability and delivers submission. It offers loans and demands sovereignty. And the pattern has never failed. 152 countries, same blueprint, same results, debt, dependence, extraction. And now that same mechanism is being prepared for deployment against the United States because the math doesn't care about military power or nuclear weapons or historical exceptionalism. When you owe more than you can repay, you lose control. The creditors take over and the US is $38 trillion in debt with no plan to stop borrowing. The trap is closing. Most Americans don't see it yet, but the developing world knows exactly what's coming because they've already lived through it. The question is whether you recognize the pattern before it's too late. If this showed you a system you didn't know existed, subscribe immediately and turn on notifications. The next video covers the Chinese debt trap strategy through Belt and Road and how it's the same IMF playbook, but executed faster and with 21st century tools. You need to see it. The debt trap isn't theory. It's a proven weapon that's conquered 152 nations over 60 years, and it's coming for America next. The pattern is clear. The timeline is 5 to 10 years. And the only question is whether you prepare before the trap closes.